Alien Empire expected fear during first contact. Instead, humanity's response changed the tone of the meeting. On the 14th of March 2214, the Vorath Dominion's long-range survey vessel Ascendant Measure completed a passive scan of the Sol system. The data it gathered was transmitted back to Vorath High Command across a relay network that spanned 11 star systems and took, by human reckoning, approximately 4 days to arrive. What the Vorath read in that data set the course of everything that followed. Humanity, according to the Ascendant Measure's instruments, possessed 11 military-grade orbital stations, a significant debris field of decommissioned weapons platforms that were no longer active but clearly still functional with minor repair, 4 deep space listening posts at the outer edge of the system, and an asteroid belt that had been quietly, methodically industrialized. Earth's surface showed clear signatures of directed energy testing ranges, not weapons actively pointing at anything, just facilities that had been built, calibrated, and used. The Vorath analysts assigned to the report noted these details, flagged them as mildly noteworthy, and categorized humanity in the standard tier, a Class II emergent species. Dangerous to itself. Manageable from the outside. What the analysts missed, what the Ascendant Measure sensors were not sensitive enough to detect, were the silent installations. The ones humanity hadn't built near its planets. The ones humanity had built in the dark, between the orbits of Jupiter and Saturn, positioned not for planetary defense but for deep space interdiction. Those had been there for 60 years. They looked at what we showed them and missed what we hid. That wasn't an accident. That was doctrine. Admiral Priya Vasquez Okafor, Unified Human Defense Command, post-contact testimony. The story of humanity's preparation for alien contact is not a simple one. It does not begin with a visionary leader or a single catalyzing event. It begins, rather, with a paper published in 2079 by a group of strategists, xenobiologists, and game theorists working under a joint university and defense research mandate. The paper's title was Dry and Academic, Non-Zero Contact, Probability Modeling for First Encounter Scenarios with Technologically Superior External Civilizations. It was not widely read at the time. It was, however, read by the right people. The paper's central finding was blunt. If a civilization capable of crossing interstellar distances made contact with humanity, the probability that their intentions were purely benign hovered around 14%, contingent on a range of factors that humanity could not predict or control. The probability that they would arrive with a standard framework for assessing and ranking encountered civilizations, and that this framework would favor submission or assimilation, was estimated at 61%. The most likely first contact scenario, in other words, was not a greeting. It was an evaluation. The paper's recommended response was equally blunt. Humanity should not attempt to hide or to project helplessness. A species that appeared weak would likely be treated as weak. Instead, humanity should do something far more difficult. It should appear exactly as strong as it was, no more and no less, while simultaneously denying any external observer a clear picture of its actual strategic depth. Reveal the visible deterrent. Conceal the real one. That recommendation became, over the next century and a half, the foundational doctrine of the Unified Human Defense Command's First Contact Division. It was called, informally, the Measured Response Protocol. Formally, it had a designation that will not be recounted here because it remains classified. What matters is what it produced. A solar system that looked, to any scanning vessel passing through the outer dark, exactly like a young military power still finding its footing, and nothing like what it actually was. The Vorath Dominion arrived in the Sol system on the 3rd of August 2214 with 7 vessels. By their own internal classification system, this constituted a first-tier contact fleet. Large enough to demonstrate authority, not so large as to trigger panic in the contacted species. They had done this before. The pattern was reliable. The new civilization would see the fleet, register the scale of the technology gap, and the opening negotiating position would be set before a single word was exchanged. Fear, the Vorath had long since concluded, was the most efficient first contact tool available. Vorath Dominion/Contact Fleet Alpha/Command Log, translated excerpt. Approach vector. Sol system inbound $0.80 from inner boundary. Contact species, human, Sol 3 designation. Fleet composition, 7 vessels, standard T1 contact configuration. Strategic assessment, Class II emergent. Orbital capability confirmed. Anticipated response, standard fear submission gradient. Protocol A engagement. Note, passive scan data indicates limited deep space assets. Approach risk, low. They began decelerating toward Earth, broadcasting their presence on the standard diplomatic frequencies the Vorith used for all first contacts. Frequencies derived from hydrogen line mathematics, on the assumption that any spacefaring species would recognize them. It was, in their long experience, a gesture of controlled magnanimity. We come visible and we come first. That itself is a message about hierarchy. What they did not know, as their 7 vessels slipped past the orbit of Saturn, was that they had already been tracked for 9 days. That every sensor array in their contact fleet had been catalogued, characterized, and gently, invisibly mapped. That the first contact division had already convened, reviewed the Vorith fleet composition, and authorized the second phase of the measured response protocol. Humanity had not sent a signal. It hadn't needed to. The Vorith's own approach was the signal. And humanity's response was already in motion. Lead Commander Davorak 7 had conducted 43 first contacts over the course of his career. He was, by Vorith standards, experienced to the point of institutional authority. He had seen fear in many forms. The scrambled, panicked military responses of civilizations that recognized the power differential immediately, the dignified, formal overtures of civilizations that understood they were overmatched but chose to negotiate from whatever small leverage they possessed, and the rare, unfortunate cases of civilizations that chose defiance, which had never ended well for anyone involved. He catalogued these responses the way a naturalist catalogues species. They were predictable. They were, ultimately, manageable. What he saw, 7 hours into the contact fleet's approach toward the inner solar system, did not fit any category in his experience. It began with a sensor reading that his tactical officer, Marith, flagged without immediately understanding what she was looking at. A mass signature moving. Multiple mass signatures, in fact, resolving slowly from the background noise of the asteroid belt region. Not stationary platforms. Not debris. Vessels. Organized. Moving in formation on an intercept course, at a velocity that, Marith ran the calculation twice before reporting it, meant they had departed their holding positions approximately 9 days ago. 9 days ago, the Vorith fleet had crossed the heliopause, the boundary of the solar system. They had barely entered human-monitored space when humanity had, apparently, already decided what it was going to do about them. There is a specific quality to the silence that falls on a command deck when sensor data contradicts everything you expected to find. I have been told there is no Vorith word for that feeling. We had to explain it to them much later. Tactical Officer Marith, Vorith Dominion Contact Fleet Alpha, debriefing. Davorak 7 ordered the fleet to maintain course and reduce speed. This was standard doctrine when a contacted species showed unexpected military movement. Decelerate, demonstrate you are not accelerating toward them, give the situation room to develop. He was not alarmed. Not yet. The human fleet resolving on his sensors was, he checked the numbers twice the way Marith had, 14 vessels. Larger than his 7 but not dramatically so. And the technology signatures, based on drive emissions and hull displacement, suggested human vessels were individually less capable than Vorith equivalents. Numbers and size, however, were not the thing that began to shift something in Davorak 7's assessment. It was the formation. The 14 human vessels were not arranged defensively. They were not clustered around Earth or positioned to protect the inner planets. They were deployed in a configuration that Davorak 7's tactical databases, after a 2-second analysis, matched to an offensive blocking pattern. A formation specifically designed not to protect what was behind it but to control the space in front of it. To deny an incoming force freedom of movement. To make any advance past a certain point dependent on first engaging the formation itself. They were not defending their homeworld. They were coming out to meet him, and they were coming out in a way that said, "You will not pass until we decide you may." Davorak 7 requested a channel to his political liaison, Ambassador Vorith, who was quartered in the fleet's diplomatic vessel at the rear of the formation. He described what the sensors were showing. There was a pause before Vorith responded. It was not a long pause, but it was notable. In 40 years of joint operations, Davorak 7 had rarely heard Vorith pause at anything. Vorith Contact Fleet Alpha/Internal Channel, translated. Davorak 7, Ambassador. I'm looking at 14 human military vessels in an active blocking formation, on intercept to our current position. They are not defending. They are moving to intercept. Vorith, how long have they been moving? Davorak 7, trajectory analysis puts departure at 9 days prior to today. They began moving when we crossed the heliopause. Vorith, 4.2-second pause, they were tracking us before we entered the system properly. Davorak 7, yes, Ambassador. Vorith, and they chose not to respond until now. Davarak 7, that is correct. Vorith, 3.7-second pause, revise the threat assessment. Begin protocol review. The human fleet continued its approach. It did not accelerate aggressively. It did not broadcast any threatening signals. It moved at a steady, measured pace that would bring it into close communication range within approximately 18 hours. The formation held. The spacing between vessels was precise, too precise for a hastily assembled response. This was a drilled pattern, executed by crews who had trained for it. From Earth, a transmission arrived on the Vorith diplomatic frequency. A voice, female, calm, unhurried, speaking in a language the Vorith translation systems had assembled from decades of passively harvesting human broadcasts. The words were unambiguous. They had been composed, it was later determined, by a committee of linguists, diplomats, and military communication specialists over the preceding 48 hours. The message said, "We have been expecting contact. We welcome dialogue. Our escort fleet will guide you to a designated meeting point. Please maintain your current formation and follow the lead vessel's navigation signals. We look forward to a productive conversation." Not a warning. Not a plea. Not a declaration. An invitation, from the people who had just positioned 14 warships between an alien contact fleet and their homeworld, phrased with the quiet confidence of a host welcoming guests to a house that the guests were now beginning to understand they had profoundly underestimated. Davarak 7 sat with the message for a long time. Then he gave the order to reduce speed further and hold position. He needed to think. This was not Protocol A territory anymore. In the 18 hours that followed, neither side moved aggressively. The human fleet maintained its position, not static but holding a slow, patient orbit that kept it between the Vorith ships and the inner system, at a range of approximately 40,000 kilometers. Close enough to communicate clearly. Far enough to prevent the kind of misunderstandings that proximity sometimes generated. The Vorith fleet held its own position and, to their credit, did not attempt any kind of probe or scan that would have read as hostile. Both sides in different ways were taking the measure of each other. On the human side of that gap, aboard the command vessel UHDS Meridian, Admiral Priya Veskazokafor spent much of those 18 hours doing something her staff found somewhat unsettling. She slept, ate 2 meals, and reviewed the Vorith fleet's engineering signatures with the careful patience of someone reading a technical manual. She was not dramatic about it. The First Contact Division had been running simulations and planning sessions for this scenario, not this specific scenario, but scenarios of this general shape, for longer than she had been alive. She had joined the division 30 years ago as a junior analyst. She had risen through it steadily, not because of any exceptional gift for crisis but because of an exceptional gift for preparation. She knew what she knew. She trusted the doctrine. She waited. The weight of those 18 hours fell harder on the Vorith. We had expected to be the ones setting the tempo. The humans offered us an invitation and then simply waited. They did not fill the silence with reassurances or additional signals. They let it sit. It was the most effective pressure I have experienced in 4 decades of contact operations. Ambassador Vorith, Vorith Dominion, Post-Contact Diplomatic Memoir. Vorith was not inexperienced with alien psychology. He had spent his career studying the behavioral patterns of contacted species, how they processed threat, how they negotiated under stress, what cultural frameworks shaped their conception of hierarchy and respect. Humanity's file was extensive. The Vorith had been passively monitoring human broadcasts for 60 years, and what that monitoring had revealed was a species of extraordinary behavioral complexity. Violent and cooperative simultaneously. Deeply tribal and capable of large-scale coordination when sufficiently motivated. Prone to internal conflict but also prone to moments of galvanizing unity that, historically, had consistently surprised even the humans themselves. What the monitoring had not adequately conveyed, what no amount of signal intelligence fully captured, was the particular quality of human patience when humans had decided they were prepared for something. There was a composure to the human fleet's waiting that read, to Vorith analysts reviewing the sensor data, less like restraint and more like settled confidence. They were not waiting because they were afraid to move. They were waiting because they had already decided the situation was under control. Vorith convened a command review at hour 12. His staff laid out what was known. The human fleet composition, 14 vessels, mixed classes, all displaying active shields but no weapons charged. The human formation, blocking, disciplined, and, this detail had been added to the tactical assessment in the last hour, exactly positioned to maximize their sensor coverage of the Vorith fleet while minimizing the Vorith's ability to get clean readings of anything behind them. The humans were, in other words, letting the Vorith see them clearly while offering the Vorith as little strategic intelligence about their own rear positions as possible. Someone on Vorith's staff noted that the human fleet's formation also had a secondary characteristic. It was defensible from multiple approach vectors simultaneously. If a second contact fleet had been positioned somewhere in the outer system, a precaution the Vorith had not taken, but one that the humans apparently had modeled as a possibility, the blocking formation would have remained coherent against that threat as well. They had, apparently, considered the contingency of reinforcement. This prompted Vorith to request a full deep system scan. The results came back 3 hours later. Vorith Sensor Division/Deep System Survey, Seoul, translated excerpt. Confirmed additional assets detected. 6 additional military vessels, holding position near Saturn orbital band. 3 large displacement installations, asteroid belt midsection, confirmed weapons signature. 2 deep space platforms outer system function, unclear, high-power emitter arrays. Multiple small craft signatures throughout inner system, possible patrol craft. Assessment note: initial passive survey significantly underrepresented human military asset density. Recommend comprehensive reassessment of Class 2 emergent classification. Vorith read the report twice. Then he called Davorak 7. The deep scan is complete, he said. What you need to understand, he continued in the carefully measured tone of a diplomat processing a significant recalibration, is that what we initially assessed as their fleet was not their fleet. That was what they chose to show us first. Davorak 7 was quiet for a moment. And the 14 vessels in front of us? An escort. Formally positioned as 1-2, the communication phrased it as an escort, which we interpreted as diplomatic language. I'm no longer certain it was diplomatic language. I think it may have been a technical description. There is a Vorith concept, roughly translatable as weight of space, that describes the feeling of a tactical environment in which an opponent holds more variables than you have accounted for. Senior commanders are trained to recognize it, to treat it as a signal to slow down rather than accelerate, and to resist the temptation to act boldly in order to reassert a sense of control. Davorak 7 had felt it twice before in his career, both times in live-fire exercises. He felt it now, settling over the command deck of his vessel like a change in atmospheric pressure. He accepted the invitation. He signaled humanity that the Vorith fleet would follow their escort to the designated meeting point. He did it calmly, professionally, and without any indication of what had just shifted in his assessment of the situation. That too was doctrine. Both sides, it turned out, were very good at composure. The meeting point humanity had designated was L4, one of the stable gravitational balance points in the Earth-Moon system, approximately 60 degrees ahead of the Moon in its orbit. It was not a coincidental choice. L4 had been used for decades as a staging area for deep space operations. It was well within human sensor coverage, within rapid response range of both Earth and the lunar installations, and it had the navigational characteristic of being a position that a vessel could hold without expending significant fuel. Staying there was easy. Leaving in a hurry was slightly more complicated, a function of orbital mechanics that any competent navigator would recognize immediately. The Vorith navigators recognized it within minutes of receiving the coordinates. They flagged it in their tactical assessment as a position that favored the host. They did not object. To object would have been to admit they had noticed, and admitting they had noticed would have required them to articulate what it was they were worried about. Neither Vorith nor Davorak 7 was prepared to do that on an open channel. The transit from the holding point to L4 took 11 hours. During that time, the human escort fleet maintained its formation around the Vorith vessels with a precision that was, if you looked at it charitably, a masterclass in spatial awareness, and if you looked at it less charitably, a quiet demonstration of exactly how well the human ships could track and pace a foreign fleet. The escort vessels never crowded the Vorith ships. They maintained consistent spacing, matched velocity changes within seconds, and communicated only when necessary. Course adjustments, approach vectors, the occasional confirmation that all 7 Vorith vessels were still holding formation. Professional. Unhurried. Thorough. They flew their escort like they had done it before. They hadn't, of course, we were the first alien fleet they had ever guided through their system. But they flew it like they had done it 1,000 times. Navigation Officer Savath, UHDS Meridian, post-contact debrief. At L4, humanity had positioned what appeared, at first scan, to be a single large station. It was, in fact, 3 modular installations connected by pressurized transit tunnels, the whole assembly spanning approximately 2 kilometers. The outer hull bore visible weapons emplacements, not pointed at anything, just visible in the way that a uniform with rank insignia is visible. Informational, not threatening. The station also had, on its sunward face, what the Vorath analysts identified as extensive sensor arrays, and on its anti-sunward face, docking bays large enough to accommodate vessels somewhat larger than the Vorath diplomatic ship. They had built this for the meeting. Not for this specific meeting. The assembly bore signs of years of construction and use. But it had been built with a meeting of this type in mind, which meant they had been planning for it. Long-range planning. Sustained, funded, institutionalized planning. The kind that required political will across multiple administrations and generations, and the kind that produced facilities designed not for the drama of a single encounter but for the practicalities of a relationship that was expected to last. Admiral Vasquez Okafor's initial contact with Davorak 7 and Ambassador Vorath took place over audio-video link before anyone transferred to the station. Standard protocol: exchange initial communications, establish translation baselines, give both sides an opportunity to visually assess each other before committing to close proximity. Humanity's translation systems were good. Not perfect, but good enough for functional communication, and they improved in real time as the conversation progressed, the AI quietly adjusting phoneme mappings and idiomatic equivalences with each exchange. Vasquez Okafor was direct without being confrontational. She welcomed the Vorath fleet, acknowledged that the encounter was historic for both species, confirmed that the station facilities included life support environments compatible with Vorath biology. They had done their homework on that too, derived from atmospheric composition data in the original passive scan, and proposed an agenda for the formal meetings. The agenda was structured and specific. It covered 7 topics, in an order that began with mutual recognition and ended with long-term frameworks for continued contact. Vorath noted, with the careful attention of a career diplomat, that the agenda did not include any topic that could be characterized as negotiating terms of submission, coexistence hierarchy, or resource access frameworks, all of which were standard agenda items in Vorath first contact meetings. What the human agenda assumed, implicitly but very clearly, was that both parties were entering the conversation as peers. Not as a dominant civilization and a new discovery, but as 2 established, capable civilizations with an interest in defining a productive relationship. Ambassador Vorath, personal encrypted log, translated. Day 2, L4 station contact. They have offered us an agenda that contains no submission language. None. I have reviewed it 3 times. The closest it comes is the phrase, mutual recognition frameworks, which in context means exactly what it says. They recognize us, we recognize them, both as entities with standing. I do not know if they understand what they have done by framing it this way. I suspect they understand completely. This is a species that had deep-range listening posts that we didn't detect. They don't stumble into things. The first formal meeting was scheduled for 36 hours after the fleet's arrival at L4. In the intervening time, both sides continued their careful mutual observation. Human technicians made visible preparations at the station, adjusting atmospheric partitions, calibrating the translation relay systems, moving equipment with the organized efficiency of people completing a task they have prepared for extensively. Vorath crew members, watching on external cameras, noted the lack of visible ceremony or theater. Humanity was not performing preparation, it was executing it. Davorak 7 spent much of those 36 hours in his own quarters, reviewing everything his staff had compiled. At one point he called up the original approach assessment that had launched the contact mission, the report that had classified humanity as a Class 2 emergent, low approach risk, anticipated response of standard fear submission gradient. He stared at it for a long time. Then he filed a preliminary reassessment of his own, changing the classification to something the Vorath system had no standard category for, and noting in the comments field that the original survey data had been structurally incomplete in ways that were, in retrospect, difficult to attribute entirely to sensor limitations. Someone had made deliberate choices about what humanity showed to long-range passive scans. The Vorath had read what they were meant to read and had missed everything else. He filed the report. He thought about what it meant. And then he prepared himself as carefully as he had ever prepared for anything, for a meeting he no longer believed he fully understood the shape of. The conference room aboard the L4 station had been designed by a committee that included a xenobiologist, 2 military diplomats, a psychologist specializing in high-stakes negotiation environments, and, in a decision that raised some eyebrows at the time, a theater set designer who had spent 20 years working in immersive environmental storytelling. The result was a space that did not announce itself. It was not imposing. It was not austere. The ceiling height was generous without being cavernous. The lighting was calibrated to a spectrum that the xenobiology team had determined would be comfortable for both human and Vorath visual systems. The table was circular. The seating on both sides was identical. There was no head of the table. This was, if you thought about it, a very specific statement. Ambassador Vorath thought about it the moment he entered. He was, to his credit, a diplomat of considerable sophistication, and he understood immediately that nothing in the room's design was accidental. The circularity of the table denied any party the symbolic advantage of the power position. The identical seating denied any hierarchy of comfort. The absence of visible military presence inside the room, though every person in that room understood that military presence was very close outside it, framed the conversation as a civilian diplomatic engagement rather than a negotiation conducted under visible duress. They had framed the meeting as one between governments, not between a fleet and a target. The room told us what kind of conversation they intended to have before anyone said a word. I had spent 40 years learning how to read rooms. I had never had a room speak this clearly. Ambassador Vorath, Diplomatic Memoir, Chapter 11. Admiral Vasquez Okafor had chosen not to lead the human delegation herself. She was present, seated to the right of the lead human diplomat, Dr. Arav Nair, who held the title of Secretary of First Contact under the Unified Earth Government's Diplomatic Corps. This was another deliberate choice. By seating the military commander in a secondary position while a civilian diplomat led, humanity communicated something about how it categorized this meeting. As a diplomatic engagement, not a military one. The fleet outside was context. The conversation inside was the point. Nair opened the formal session with a prepared statement that the Vorath translation systems processed with approximately 94% fidelity, good enough for substance, with occasional lapses in nuance. The statement was notably free of appeals to common interest, shared values, or the traditional diplomatic language that tended to front-load first contact negotiations with reassurances of peaceful intent. Nair did not say humanity came in peace. He said humanity had been expecting this meeting, had prepared for it, and was ready to discuss the terms under which two interstellar-capable civilizations might establish a stable, mutually understood relationship. The word stable had been chosen by the Linguistics Committee after considerable debate. It carried a specific freight. It implied that the relationship was something that could become unstable, and that both parties had an interest in preventing that. It was the mildest possible articulation of mutual deterrence, wrapped in a word that sounded cooperative. Vorath recognized it. He was certain Davarak 7, seated beside him, did not. That level of linguistic subtlety was a diplomatic skill, not a tactical one. But Vorath caught it, and catching it told him something important. Whoever had drafted this statement had understood that he would catch it. The statement was not designed to deceive. It was designed to communicate on two levels simultaneously, the surface level of diplomatic welcome, and the substrata level of capability acknowledgement. Humanity was announcing, with a single carefully chosen word, that it understood deterrence theory. Davarak 7 spoke first for the Vorath side. He kept his opening formal and brief, which surprised Vorath slightly. The standard contact fleet commander's opening was longer, and included several passages about the Dominion's history and scope that served, in practice, as implicit demonstrations of scale and power. Davarak 7 omitted those passages. Later, reviewing his notes, Vorath concluded that the commander had made a rapid mid-course adjustment. The scale demonstrations would have read differently here than they were designed to read elsewhere. In this room, given what the Vorath now knew about what was parked outside it, performing scale felt like the wrong register. Davarak 7 had sensed that and adapted. He was, Vorath reflected, a good commander. Not a great diplomat but good enough to know when the diplomatic instinct was the right one. Unified Earth Government, First Contact Division/Session Transcript, Excerpt. Nair. We propose beginning with a mutual disclosure framework. Each party communicates the information it is willing to share regarding its technological capabilities, territorial boundaries, and current geopolitical structure. Neither party is obligated to share information it considers sensitive. What is shared becomes the basis for initial relationship parameters. Vorath. After consultation with Davarak 7, the Dominion finds this framework acceptable. We note it is unusual. Nair, in what sense? Vorath, it does not establish a hierarchy. It assumes equivalent standing. Nair, pause, yes. That is what it does. There were 5 seconds of silence after that exchange. In the recording, reviewed later by both diplomatic teams, those 5 seconds would become something of a defining moment. Nair's confirmation, quiet, unadorned, carrying no defensiveness and no apology, said, more completely than any prepared statement could, what humanity's position was. We know what we are. We know what you expected to find. We are telling you, calmly and without animosity, that this conversation begins from a different place than you planned for. Vorith responded, after those 5 seconds, with a phrase that his translation team later struggled to render adequately, something that carried the sense of formal acknowledgement with an undertone of a traveler who has arrived at a destination and discovered the landscape is quite different from the map. He accepted the framework. He accepted the standing assumption. And in doing so, he did something that no contacted species in Vorith Dominion records had ever done at the first formal meeting. He accepted a conversation that the contacted species had defined, rather than one the Dominion had arranged. The tone had been set. Not through threats. Not through demonstrations of firepower. Through the quiet, accumulated weight of preparation, of a species that had thought about this moment for over a century and had decided, with remarkable clarity, exactly how it wanted the first conversation to go. The formal meetings lasted 9 days. This was significantly longer than any previous Vorith first contact engagement. Standard protocol called for an initial contact period of 48 to 72 hours, long enough to establish basic communication, transmit the standard Dominion integration framework, and receive the contacted species' formal response, which was typically some variant of compliance with occasional requests for terms. 9 days was not a standard duration because 9 days implied that both sides had things to say, and that what they were saying was complicated enough to require extended deliberation. On day 3, the humans shared their mutual disclosure package. It had been prepared over an 18-month period by a joint team drawn from the First Contact Division, Military Intelligence, the Unified Earth Government Scientific Community, and a panel of historians and ethicists whose job had been to advise on what disclosures might create future vulnerabilities and what withholdings might create future misunderstandings. The result was a document of extraordinary calibration, detailed enough to be credible, selective enough to preserve strategic ambiguity, and structured in a way that told the Vorith significantly more about how humanity thought than about any specific capability humanity possessed. The Vorith's own disclosure package was thorough by their standards, which were standards developed for an asymmetric process. What they typically disclosed to contacted species was largely benign: population data, territorial scope, a sanitized overview of Dominion governance, because full disclosure to a newly contacted Class II emergent was considered unnecessary and potentially counterproductive to establishing the proper relationship dynamic. What they brought to the table here, facing a disclosure from humanity that made clear this was a symmetric exchange, required rapid improvisation. Vorith spent most of day 2 revising their own disclosure, quietly, in consultation with Davarak 7. The result was notably more substantive than what they would normally have offered. We had prepared to brief them on what we thought they needed to know. Then we saw what they thought we needed to know, and we understood that the calibration was wrong. We revised. Ambassador Vorith, post-contact debrief, Day 4. On Day 5, something occurred that neither party had specifically planned for, and which later became one of the most discussed moments in both species' historical records of the encounter. During a working session on communication protocols, a technical discussion, not a high-stakes political exchange, a Vorith analyst named Severak, who had been brought on the mission as a xenolinguistic specialist, asked Dr. Nair a direct question. He asked how long humanity had been aware of the Vorith Dominion's existence. There was a brief consultation on the human side. Nair checked with an aide who reviewed a document, and then Nair turned back and answered with a precision that landed in the room like a quiet calibration shock. 47 years, he said. Humanity had detected the Vorith's long-range survey passes. Not the most recent one but the initial ones, the exploratory scouts, 47 years ago. 17 years before the survey that had produced the report classifying humanity as Class II emergent and low risk. Humanity had, in other words, known the Vorith existed for almost half a century, had watched the Vorith watching them, had made decisions about what to show and what to conceal with that knowledge informing every choice, and had spent the intervening decades preparing for an encounter whose timeline they had estimated to within a few years of the actual approach. Severak sat with this for several seconds. Then he asked a follow-up question. Had humanity considered making contact first? Nair's answer was measured and without any apparent intent to wound, which made it significantly more impactful than if it had been wielded as a weapon. He said, the First Contact Division had modeled that option extensively, and had concluded that initiating contact from a position of technological uncertainty, meaning not knowing how much the Vorith actually knew about humanity, created unacceptable strategic risk. If the Vorith were already operating from a framework that assumed dominance over contacted species, an unsolicited contact from humanity might have been interpreted as an attempt to establish preemptive diplomatic cover before a suspected Vorith approach. This could have been read as either fear or cunning, and both interpretations created dynamics that were difficult to control. Waiting, and using the waiting time to prepare, gave humanity the ability to define the terms of first contact through actions rather than through appeals. First contact session, Day 5/working transcript, excerpt. Severak, you knew we were coming. 447 years. Nair, we knew someone was coming. We assessed a high probability it was the same civilization that had been conducting survey passes in this region for roughly 6 decades. Severak, and you said nothing. Nair, we prepared. Severak, pause, what would you have done if we had not come? Nair, continued preparing. We were in no hurry. The initiative was yours. The last line of that exchange, the initiative was yours, required 3 minutes of translation discussion before the Vorith team confirmed they had understood it correctly. The concept it expressed was not difficult. What required the discussion was confirming that it was not a provocation, not a boast, not a formal statement of grievance. It was a factual description. Humanity had recognized that the Vorith held the initiative, the decision of when to make formal contact and on what terms, and had made their preparation strategy a function of that reality. They had not tried to seize the initiative. They had built a framework that turned the initiative into something less decisive than the Vorith had expected it to be. Vorith, reviewing the session recording that evening, wrote a single line in his personal log. They are not afraid of us and they are not angry at us, and I'm not certain which of those facts is harder to account for. On Day 7, the Vorith formally requested a modification to the mutual disclosure framework that Nair had proposed at the opening. They wanted to expand it, to share more. The original framework had been designed for a minimum viable exchange, enough to establish basic understanding. The Vorith were now proposing something significantly more substantive. Nair accepted, on behalf of the human delegation, without visible surprise and without any of the pleasure that the human team, in their private communications, acknowledged feeling. The session went long. The translation systems worked hard. By the end, both sides had more of the other's map than either had expected to hold after a 9-day meeting. On Day 8, Davarak 7 requested a private meeting with Vasquez Okafor. Just the two of them, no diplomatic staff, with a minimal translation relay. Commander to Admiral. Military to military, without the formal architecture of the diplomatic process around it. She agreed. What they discussed was not recorded. By mutual agreement it was not. What is known is that the meeting lasted 4 hours, and that when both officers returned to their respective delegations, something in Davarak 7's posture had changed in a way that his staff noted but could not precisely characterize. He was not diminished. He was not subdued. He was, Vorith later wrote, recalibrated. On the 9th day, the formal sessions concluded with the signing of what was designated the L4 Accord, a preliminary framework document establishing mutual recognition, basic communication protocols, a boundary understanding pending further negotiation, and a timeline for continued diplomatic engagement. It was 16 pages long in its human text version and somewhat longer in the Vorith translation, due to the Vorith diplomatic language's structural tendency toward elaboration. It was not a treaty in any final sense. It was a foundation. Both sides understood this, and both sides understood that the quality of what was built on it would depend heavily on what came next. What the L4 Accord notably did not contain, any hierarchy of standing between the two civilizations, any acknowledgement of Vorith precedence, territorial authority, or integration framework, any submission clauses, any language suggesting that humanity was a newly encountered civilization being incorporated into an existing order. In the standard Vorith First Contact document template, which had been used with modifications in 43 prior encounters, all of these elements were present. The L4 Accord used none of them. The document Vorith signed was not, in any meaningful sense, the standard contact document. It was a different document, written from different assumptions, which humanity had drafted and which the Vorith had accepted. We came to administer a standard contact. We concluded a peer negotiation. The distance between those two things is where the story lives. Ambassador Vorith, addressed to the Vorith Diplomatic Academy, 2 years post-contact. The Vorith fleet departed the Sol system 14 days after arrival, 9 days of formal meetings, 3 days of post-session technical exchanges and document review, and 2 days of transit preparation. They left the way they had arrived, in formation at a measured pace, with the human escort fleet accompanying them back to the outer system boundary and then peeling away with professional precision. There were no ceremonies at the departure. A brief communication, formally worded, confirming the fleet's exit trajectory and expressing an intent to re-establish contact within the agreed timeline. Then they were gone, back into the dark, carrying with them something they had not carried into the system: a revised understanding of what they had encountered. Aboard the Ascendant Measure, the original survey vessel that had set all of this in motion, the analyst who had written the initial Class 2 emergent assessment was quietly informed that his report would be reviewed and formally corrected in the Dominion's contact database. He was not disciplined. The assessment had been made in good faith on the data available, and the data had been, by design, incomplete. He was, however, transferred to a new research assignment, heading a small team tasked with reviewing all previous passive surveys in the Dominion's contact history to determine whether other civilizations had employed similar information management strategies, and if so, to what degree the Dominion's existing assessments needed revision. It was, in its way, humanity's most lasting immediate impact on the Vorith Dominion. Not through direct confrontation, not through any dramatic demonstration of capability, but through the quiet revelation that the Dominion's intelligence framework had a structural vulnerability. It trusted that what a civilization chose to show on passive scan was a reasonably complete picture of that civilization's actual capabilities. It had never been designed to account for a civilization that had actively managed what it showed, because no prior contacted civilization had done so with anything approaching this level of sophistication or duration. The Dominion spent the next several years quietly reviewing its contact history. It found 3 other cases where passive survey data had potentially been managed. None were as comprehensive as humanity's effort, but all 3 were significant enough to prompt re-evaluation. The ripple effect of the L4 encounter was, in some respects, more structurally impactful on the Dominion than the encounter itself. Humanity had, without intending to specifically, introduced a new variable into the Voritha's operational worldview: doubt about the completeness of their own picture. That doubt was productive. It made them more careful. It made them better. On Earth, the L4 Accord was received with a mixture of relief, cautious optimism, and the particular brand of satisfaction that comes from a long-prepared plan unfolding more or less as designed. Admiral Vasquez Okafor gave a brief public address from the station before returning to Earth, in which she offered no triumphalism and made no claims about humanity's strength or the Voritha's weakness. She said that the encounter had gone well, that both parties had been professional, and that the work of building a stable, productive relationship with a spacefaring civilization was only beginning. She thanked the crews of both fleets for their composure. She thanked the diplomatic teams. She thanked, in particular, the researchers who had written the 2079 paper, 2 of whom were still alive and watched the address from a university common room in Bangalore with the specific quiet pleasure of people who had been right about something for a very long time. Admiral Vasquez Okafor, Public Address Excerpt, L4 Station 2214. The Vorith came expecting a particular kind of encounter. We prepared for a different one. I want to be clear about something. We did not do this by pretending to be more than we are, or less. We did it by being exactly what we are, a civilization that takes the long view, that prepares before it has to, and that believes the best outcome of any first meeting is one where both sides leave with more information and more respect than they arrived with. We are not done. This is a beginning, not an ending. But it is a good beginning, and it was made possible by the work of generations of people who understood that how you enter a room matters as much as what you say once you're in it. The L4 Accord held. The follow-on negotiations that began 8 months later were complex, sometimes contentious, and produced agreements that both sides revised over the subsequent decades as the relationship evolved. There were difficult moments, misunderstandings with real consequences, disputes over boundary definitions and systems that both civilizations had surveyed and neither had settled, cultural frictions that proved more persistent than either diplomatic team had modeled. The relationship between humanity and the Vorith Dominion was not simple, because no relationship between 2 civilizations with different histories, different threat models, and different fundamental worldviews ever is. But it was stable. And it remained stable because its foundation had been set correctly, on mutual recognition, grounded in the reality that neither party could afford to treat the other as something less than it was. The Vorith had come expecting fear and had found, instead, the particular kind of confidence that does not need to announce itself. The confidence of preparation, of clarity about what you are and what you are not, of a civilization that had decided, before the meeting ever began, that it would not apologize for its existence or beg for its standing. That confidence had changed the tone of the meeting before the first word was spoken. It had changed the outcome before the first document was drafted. It had done what a century and a half of preparation had been designed to do, not win a confrontation but make the confrontation into something else entirely. A conversation. Between equals. On terms that humanity had spent generations quietly, patiently, and precisely arranging. In the Vorith Dominion's contact database, the entry for humanity was eventually revised to a classification that had no precise precedent in their system. The closest translation reads, Independent High Preparation Civilization, Non-Submission Category, Long-Range Strategic Capability Confirmed, Recommended Engagement Posture, Peer Diplomacy. In the First Contact Division's own internal records, the L4 encounter was logged under a simpler heading, Protocol Confirmed. Doctrine Validated. Proceed to Phase 2. Humanity had not been afraid. It had not pretended not to be afraid. It had, with uncommon patience, done something more difficult than either. It had made the question of fear entirely irrelevant. And that, in the end, was the most human thing about it.